If Paul thought that the old covenant was done, then why would he do the practices that were from the old covenant? So if you're reading Galatians and Romans or any of the other epistles of Paul as if he's doing away with the Hebrew Bible, you're wrong. You're doing it wrong. You're reading it wrong, because he's not. Well, welcome everyone to another episode of Luke Reacts. Now, I'm going to do something I haven't done in a long time, almost a year, where I am going to put on a video of Tucker Carlson and a guy named Andrew Isker. Andrew is a pastor in Tennessee and has started a community of Christians that are, well, the goal is to thrive and to really build, the perfect community, the community of Bible-believing people who share common values and live in proximity to each other. So it's not like a house kind of commune kind of thing, and it's not Anabaptist. It's actually Reformed Presbyterian-ish, but it is a very interesting conversation between Tucker Carlson and Andrew Isker. And I brought him on because he continues to have a kind of an ongoing kind of thread throughout, not just this video, but some other ones I saw, where he's kind of trying to shape the conversation related to Israel and the Jewish people. Obviously, Tucker, as many of you know, has been critical of Israel and Jews here and there. And so I thought for a moment, hey, let's have Tucker on with this guy and kind of I can react to kind of the stuff that they're saying. Now, before I get there, please like and subscribe to this channel. We are closing in on 25,000 subscribers, and it would be great if you helped us tip the scale there. And also, like this video. I think it will be very interesting. I've got my Bible ready, and I am going to kind of unpack some of the theology that they kind of weigh in on, kind of explore some of the issues that they're exploring. Now, this whole episode was an hour and a half. And if you're about to turn off because you think I'm going to share and react to an hour and a half video, well, you don't have to turn it off, because I'm not going to react to a full hour and a half video. I'm going to react to the part that get to the juicy parts, which is the parts of the, related to Israel, the Jewish people, that and theology, etc., that I kind of want to unpack myself. And so I want to spend a couple minutes talking about some of the stuff that is leading up to this conversation. So Andrew Isker, he's a pastor. He grew up in Minnesota, in a small town in Minnesota. He describes how his comes from 6 generations from this small town, and it was really some of the elections in, I think, 22 that kind of forced his hand. It was like, we got to get out of here. He's got some kids. He's got a wife. One of his kids is autistic, and they were really concerned about, some of the stuff that has happened in blue states across America, particularly in regard to the trans stuff. I mean, statistically, there's a disproportionate number of women who are getting top surgery and that kind of thing, who were on autistic spectrum, and vice versa. Some men pretending they're boys, pretending they're girls, and so that was a real concern for him and his family. And so they decided to move to Tennessee, go from blue state to red state. In this episode, he describes the thought process in doing that. Obviously with a kind of an affirmation from Tucker. The other issues they kind of get into leading up to this section I'm going to kind of unpack is the issue of abortion, that being one of the primary areas of topic, and then kind of like really unpacking the ideas of atheism and where does atheism find its, true core. It's kind of a mystery. It's not it's not a surprise that it's a mystery. So that becomes a big part of this conversation. And, like everybody eventually is going to worship something. So what are they going to worship? And the argument being like Christianity is the best thing to worship. And being that these, Tucker he does not describe himself as an evangelical. I've heard him several times. He grew up Episcopalian. His wife is a very committed believer. I don't know what kind of denomination they are connected to, but it's no longer Episcopalian that I know. And, he's particularly concerned, and this is a real concern, not just for him, but for me too, about the fate of young men in America. And one of the things that they're talking about, how a lot of young men in America are leaving behind the atheism, the agnosticism, the kind of the cultural zeitgeist that tells guys that, hey man, do what you got to do. Moving from potentially like an Andrew Tate role model, he's the guy who's basically says, control women, have as much sex as you can, make as much money as you can. It's like basically whatever, the most based desires. And I don't mean based as in a good thing, as in based. I mean based as in like lowest level of human thinking. Just like respond to your like urges, the reptilian urge, that kind of thing. And I think that it's within that framework that Tucker and this Andrew Isker are kind of unpacking some of the reasons why atheism has failed, the kind of the blue state stuff has failed, the woke stuff has failed, and it's failed in a lot of ways because it just didn't provide any kind of answer to young men. And Andrew kind of, I think, wants to be one of the guys that young men follow. He has been, and he says this in his opening, he says that he is he studied under Doug Wilson out of Moscow, Idaho, who's very, prominent figure in kind of these circles. He is in the Reformed camp, some form of, like I said, Presbyterianism. I think CREC is his denomination. And, it really doesn't much get, it doesn't really get into kind of the Israel conversation until about, what's my notes say? About 45 minutes into this. Okay. And so I'm going to cover, some of the about 20, 30 minutes of this conversation, because some of the stuff he unpacks, I think, is really important. I think the theology that he unpacks is important. There's somewhat of a critique of dispensationalism and this idea that Jesus is Israel. And so I thought, let's put this guy on. And, I really hope Andrew or Tucker, or Andrew and Tucker, invite me to, maybe we'll have cigars or something sometime and we can have this conversation. He does say in his conversation, he's never been to Israel, so maybe I can help get him there. But let me just pull up this presentation and we'll get started. Here we go.
Leviticus, which I read on a flight to Europe when I had made myself, because, I had 8 hours on a plane. And I texted my wife from the plane. I was like, this is excellent, actually. Yeah. It's just excellent. I thought it was going to be all like sacrificing doves because you have your period that's in there.
Yeah.
But like 95% of it made sense to me.
Well, and it's real. Like it's tangible, right? It's, in theological terms, incarnational. Like it's the real tangible world that people interact with, right? That's there. And people always ask me like, well, Andrew, what's your favorite book of the Bible? And I love to, sometimes I love to get a rise out of people, but I tell them, well, Leviticus is, and And they're like, what? Really? And I'm like, yeah. Like, I mean, I'm a pastor. My calling is to preach the gospel and to lead worship. And that book right there, all of it is about how do sinful people draw near and approach the presence of a holy, just, righteous God that cannot bear sin at all. And there it's laid out for us, all of it. And even like you look at Leviticus chapter 9.
Now, before I let him go into Leviticus too deeply, it's actually not that strange to find people very attracted to Leviticus. There was a guy years ago in the 90s named Rob Bell. Rob Bell eventually wrote a book called Love Wins and kind of disappeared from evangelical Christian circles. But he also had a church up in, might have been even Minnesota, might have been somewhere upper Midwest. And his church became a mega church because Rob Bell preached for like a series, like a year-long series out of the book of Leviticus. And it was so impactful that his church grew. And so it's not that surprising. I think when people are, not reading it well, I think they can get kind of bogged down in Leviticus. But if you're thinking about it deeply, it can be a very profound book. But here's more of Andrew.
Like you read that, maybe you remember reading it. I'm actually going through this with my church right now in Tennessee. But Leviticus chapter 9 is the entire liturgy of the church right there. Each of the sacrifices and all of the like Western liturgy for 2,000 years basically follows it, right? You're called into the presence of God. You confess your sins. I mean, you may, probably like your Episcopalian upbringing, Book of Common Prayer, like you probably track with this, right? You confess.
They never admitted that in our church.
Yeah, maybe they didn't have a confession of sin in years, but there's a confession of sin, right? Then there's an ascension, right? The ascension offering in chapter 1 of Leviticus, right? The worshiper puts his hand on the animal, right? Saying like, this animal's me. And then the entire thing is consumed, is burned up, right? Olah, right? Where the word Holocaust comes from. Consumed, burned up, goes up to God in smoke. And that's you, right? That's when, and then the New Testament where it says, right, the word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword. What's the sword of the priest that cuts up the animal and puts it on the altar and burns it up? Well, that's what's happening when the church hears the Bible read and hears it preached, right? You're being cut up by the word of God and ascending up to God in smoke. And then the next part of the service is the peace offering. Well, that's communion, right? You sit down and have a meal with God, and then you're sent out, right? The entire liturgy is right there. Like our actual worship that we do now, right after the death of Jesus and resurrection of Jesus, right? Sacrifice is done away with because he is that sacrifice. And we're going through all of that each time we.
All right. You probably heard that right there. That the sacrifice is no longer necessary. It's no longer there because he is the sacrifice. Now, one of the things that I find is interesting in this is that he is talking about the physical practice of sacrificing, the bulls, the goats, the sacrifices for the sins of the people, the process by which that happens, all that stuff. And then he points to that as this kind of liturgy, and he's taking the physical expression and he's spiritualizing it, right? He's taking that, he's describing it as, the people are cut up by the truth and their prayers are like being burnt up. It's them being burnt up. It's like there's other places in the Bible, even in the New Testament, where incense, the smoke of incense is the prayers of the people going up into heaven. Like these physical pictures of a deeper spiritual truth. Now, one of the things that the supersessionists, the replacement theology, and this Andrew guy is one of them, is they basically take all of the physicalness and say none of that matters. It is completely irrelevant. Only thing that matters is the spiritual part of it. And I find that to be uninteresting. I think the physicalness of things is actually important. It's a part of the process. Anybody who's ever gone to Israel with me has had me tell them that matter matters, right? That God actually created in a garden and put two people in it. And those two people sinned against God, and sin came into the world. But it was like there is a physicalness to God's engagement with humanity. And the problem is what a lot of Protestants do is they take and remove any physicality from the liturgy process. Yes, they'll do communion, but communion is like a physical representation of a spiritual truth, but that's kind of the only one. Maybe there's some, in the Catholic churches or the Orthodox, you get the smells and bells, and they have a bit more of this. They actually have I think a better representation of the physical. But one of the things that I find, one of the things he gets into a little bit later, but I'll share it right here because I think it's relevant, is he talks about how the rejection of physical Israel, or the rejection of, God's using Jews and physical Israel as part of his redemptive plan for humanity, has wholesale been transferred to the church, and all of those physical things, all those physical representations don't matter anymore. And he says that, well, it's all like the book of Acts unpacks this for us. And I would disagree, actually. I think a book of Acts actually makes a better case for me than for him. Because at the end of Paul's journeys, and we're talking Paul, the Apostle Paul, he becomes the apostle to the Gentiles. He's going out and he's preaching the gospel. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. And the expectation is, because Paul is going to the Gentiles, he is done with the Jews. He's like cut them off, and they are no more. And all the practices of the Jews, those don't matter anymore. And he is done with, let's say, like Judaism, right? And by Judaism, I mean like just the practice of Torah, circumcision, the keeping of the law, Sabbath, the keeping of the festivals and the feasts, etc. Okay, now. In Acts chapter 21, this is at the very end of all, like Paul has written the book of Romans, he's written the book of Galatians, he has done his missionary journeys, he goes back to Jerusalem, and he meets with James, the elder of the church in Jerusalem, and James says to him, now there are people who are saying that you are teaching Jews who live amongst the Gentiles that they do not need to keep the law, that they do not need to circumcise their children and obey the law of Moses. Therefore, go and offer sacrifices in the temple. Now, I'm paraphrasing, but you can read it. It's in Acts 21. Go for it. And in that passage, and so Paul does what James says to him to do, and he goes and offers sacrifices in the temple. Now he ultimately gets arrested, but the point is, if Paul was doing away with the things that Andrew Isker is saying are done away with, that would have been a great time for Paul to lay that out, but he doesn't. And the thing is, like, he's going to use Galatians, and Galatians was written before Romans, and Galatians was a particular context. All of the letters were a particular context. But one of the things that these supersessionists do, these replacement theology guys do, is they take their they're Gentiles, most of them. I mean, I would say most of them, and they replace the Jews with Gentiles and read themselves into the story. Now he's going to go into Matthew here. He's going to go into some other books, but he reads himself into the story in a way that I don't think he's there, and I'll explain why. But first, we got to get to there. Okay. So you got to listen on these things where he's just suddenly, talking about how impactful Leviticus is, how it points to something, a spiritual truth, which it does. It's a physical thing pointing to a spiritual truth, but it doesn't. But then he takes it one step beyond where it needs to go and say it doesn't matter anymore. You don't need to do it. Nowhere in the New Testament does that happen.
We worship and renew the covenant with God. And like you see that in Leviticus, and it's like, whoa, actually there's so much to learn here in this book about what we are doing every Sunday when we worship God. So I'm like, yeah, this, of course, it's my favorite book, right? Not just because I'm autistic and like lots of rules and regulations, right? It's like reading the instructions on the Monopoly game, you know, like, no, it's there. Like so much is happening. It's beautiful.
And the prescriptions, or the prohibitions more precisely, are surprisingly like sensible.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges to atheism is to explain why the atheist would agree with the overwhelming majority of what's prohibited.
Yeah.
Because it's in him. He knows that's wrong. Don't have sex with your sister. Okay.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah.
And most atheists would be like, yeah, well, obviously. But of course, he has no grounds upon which to say that.
Yeah.
There's literally no law he can appeal to say that.
He says that obviously because like he grew up and is reared and absorbed by osmosis, like Christian culture where that's prohibited.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
But I also think in primitive cultures that have never had exposure to Christianity, I mean, I don't know that there are many cultures where most of the prohibitions in Leviticus would be considered crazy.
No.
Or esoteric, or like, why would you ban that? It's like, every one of them, like, of course.
Well, even like you think about this, there's a pastor, theologian, brilliant guy, Peter Leithart, who wrote a book, Delivered from the Elements of the World. And in that he shows, I mean, there's tons of just amazing stuff in this book. But one of the things that he shows is that, right, God makes these restrictions for Israel in the Old Covenant, that sets them apart as this holy people, as the priestly people. But elsewhere in the world, right, they all have something like that, right? All throughout the ancient world, right? Their gods had something like a funhouse mirror version of Leviticus, where it's like, okay, right, here's all these rules about sex and what makes you clean and unclean and foods you can eat and can't eat. Like the Egyptians had this, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, all of them have these kinds of the
Mayans, the Incas, the Aztecs,
the Norse, like my ancestors, the Germanics, like they all had these rules. And it's because in the ancient world, right, they're all under their own particular gods.
All right. So I think these types of things where he's kind of talking about these other civilizations that have these other rules, I don't think they're quite the same as the Hebrew Bible. I think we can't see them the same as we can the Hebrew Bible. It is not like, you know, the Hebrew Bible is one of many books, you know, the Law of Hammurabi or the Mayans or the Incas. I mean, it is distinctive. I mean, you can read it. It talks there, like in every other cosmology. I mean, there is always a God and goddess. Always. In the Hebrew Bible, it is God, is Yahweh. There's one, not two. You know, I would say as a Christian, I could see the Trinity, but there's not a God and a goddess. Like in the Egyptian cosmology, you know, there's a God who creates the world, and there's two forms. The one cosmology says that the God spoke creation into existence, and the other said, like, basically he masturbated creation into existence. Okay, like that's the ideas. So it's not like to put the New Testament, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, into the context, the book of Leviticus, into the context of these ancient civilizations is it's a bit much. And I get where they're going, but I think they take it a little too far.
Right. Yes. And what Jesus does is he comes and he takes the world back from Satan and from all the demons that ruled over the ancient world. And now he's reigning over heaven and earth. That's actually like the book of Revelation.
I would say that actually God does that in the Hebrew Bible as well. I mean, you got to think that, like, for instance, the book of the Pentateuch was written by the first 5 books of the Bible were written by Moses. And one of those is that he's writing Genesis. He writes Genesis out under the revelation of God, and God is explaining to him the book of Genesis. And in the story, what he's doing is he's taking this idea of Egyptian cosmology that said there's these gods and goddesses, and they're doing the things in a weird way, and they're kind of doing things gross. And he's recorrecting their theology. They have a bad theology because they spent 400 years living in Egypt, thinking like Egyptians, thinking like learning the Egyptian cosmology. And through Moses, God is in the process of reorienting their understanding according to the truth of the God of the universe. That's what's happening. Okay. And not diminish that Jesus comes along and is as Hebrews says, the exact representation of God. But it's not like it started with Jesus. Jesus is going to pick up the story, and I'm not diminishing Jesus at all. He 100% believe he's the Messiah and Lord of the universe. But I think there was a lot more work being done, and what Andrew is doing, he's trying to create this bright line between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. And I think that bright line is not as bright as he thinks it is.
Right. That's actually like what's going on in that book.
The much maligned book of Revelation.
Yeah. Like I know you had John Rich on, last year, and he's talking about dispensationalism and things like that. And I was like, I'm going to be in Tennessee. I need to meet him and talk to him about this.
Did you?
I haven't. No, I have no way of getting in touch with him. Maybe after this, if you watching. Yeah.
He's a good man.
Oh, he was like the soundtrack of my youth of country music. Like he wrote all those songs, right? So on that basis alone, right? But where he's talking about like dispensationalism and what has happened in American Christianity for the last 130 years, how it's actually a novel new thing. And for me, it was like, yeah, I looked at that. I mean, I remember, growing up, and that's just everything, like Left Behind and the Rapture is coming and all of that. And
So
I knew it when I saw this section. I was like, I knew this guy was, because he's so strident in like against dispensationalism. My guess was that he read the Left Behind series. Sure enough, he mentions it. And he actually talks at some point about going to college in the early aughts. Left Behind series, for those who don't know, was this series. I mean, I'm sure most of you know it, but it sold like 60 million copies, and it was a huge phenomenon, and it was just that, Left Behind. So the people were raptured. All the Christians were raptured, and then there were people who were left behind, who had to like live through the tribulation for 7 years until Christ returns or something like that. And it was the best and worst thing that ever happened to dispensationalism, because a lot of people in America affirmed the dispensationalist understanding and reading of the book of Revelation. And then they were like, a bunch of people were like, oh, no, I don't want that at all. I remember, and the problem is that they didn't really replace it with anything. Now, I think he doesn't get into this, but Andrew Isker, I think, would be what is called a post-millennial, meaning that it's there's a process of God redeeming the whole earth. And it's a slow and steady process as the reign of Christ comes. So the three major, there's premillennial, amillennial, postmillennial. Those are kind of the three main buckets of eschatology or end times thinking. Premillennial dispensationalism is that there is a rapture followed by a tribulation for 7 years, followed by the millennial reign of Christ, and then ultimately the new heavens and new earth will be established. That is the process, and it's called dispensationalism because it argues that there are different dispensations in God's way of engaging the world, meaning periods of time, like almost like epochs. epochs, whatever, however you say that, creation, fall, the period of leading up to Noah, the the period of, like, it depends on which dispensational person you're listening to, whether there's 7 or there's more. Like there's a lot of charts involved in dispensationalism, and the critique here is this, and they make a distinction here, I'm gonna get to it, between the people who agree with dispensationalism and the people who are teaching it. Okay, now I get accused of being a dispensationalist all the time. I'm not. But I also am not opposed to it, because I can see how the argument is made. There's a clear argument against rapture, but that is being made here. But that's one of the things that the Reform guys, they don't see a rapture being biblical. I'll get into it here.
Missed all of that.
Yeah,
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's a thing. Like especially, and of course, like I'm very critical of it. But like these are the best people in America that believe it. Like the people that have like 6 Trump flags on the back of their truck.
Oh, I totally agree.
Like they also believe that, well, the rapture is coming tomorrow and we need to be ready for it. And so anytime I'm critical of it, I'm like, okay, I'm not critical of the people. Like there's not a moral defect that they believe these things.
I totally, first of all, thank you for saying that. Second, I feel what you're saying, especially with evangelicals. I look at these, greaseball preachers who I honestly, I find disgusting. And then I see the people who go to their churches and I'm like, oh, I love you. You're exactly my kind of people. You're the most decent people in this country. You're trying your very hardest against headwinds that are so unfair.
So let me just unpack this whole thing about the rapture. Now, the rapture is this idea that that basically the believing Christians will be caught up in the air at this moment. It's like, will come like a thief in the night. No one will know. I was a child of the 80s. I was born in the 70s, but I'm a child. Like, I remember the 80s better, and there was a lot of stuff going on, like the rapture's coming, the rapture, be prepared, it's coming. That was the church I grew up in myself, and I remember those things. But it's not like there's no verses that point to that. It's actually what I find a lot of people teach, like in the teaching of the books of the Bible. You get a lot of people in the Gospels, got a lot of people talking, Romans, a bunch of people talking Hebrews. They'll go through the epistles, like Ephesians, Galatians, Philippians, Colossians. Where they don't do a lot is in the book of Thessalonians. I've been going to church my whole life. The number of sermons that I have heard out of the book of Thessalonians, and there's 2 of them, is few. And one of the things that's happening in the book of Thessalonians is there's a correction being taking place. There's a couple of things that are in there. One is that there's an expectation that Christ will return at any moment. And so people have sold everything they have and are basically sitting on hilltops waiting for Christ to come back. They, are just in anticipation that it's imminent. And so Paul is basically correcting the Thessalonians by saying, wait, like, you don't know when the time is. And there's just like, there's a verse, he who doesn't work shall not eat. So he's like getting all the people who are just kind of sitting around waiting for Christ to return. But it does say in Thessalonians that will be caught up into the heavens, caught up into the sky with Christ. And so this idea of being caught up is where the idea of the rapture comes from. Okay, so it's not like it doesn't exist, and it's guys like this, and like, well, that's not what it means, and it's a later time, or it's not a time at all. It's allegoric, but nonetheless, it is there, and people duke it out. But I agree with both Tucker and Andrew here. The people that affirm this theology, salt of the earth people, love them. Don't know about the greaseball pastors and preachers. I probably agree with Tucker there, but yeah, they're salt of the earth people.
and you're doing a great job anyway. And I just love them. I really mean it. I love them. So I never want to criticize.
Ever. Yeah.
Right. Because
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so like whenever I'm critical of that theology, I'm like, I have to make sure people know, like, I'm not criticizing you because you're great, awesome people. Like even when I first went to the town in Gainesboro before we decided to, before we made our move, it was right after the hurricane, which it wasn't far from there. And this is a town that like they don't have a whole lot. The median income is not very high in this town, but I'm driving around at every gas station.
Where is it?
Gainesboro, Tennessee is in Jackson County. It's like north central Tennessee.
Okay.
And yeah. And
so every gas station
has like signs up like, hey, we're going to Western North Carolina to go help out. And it's like people that don't have a whole, like they're taking their time and what little money they have to go help people. And meanwhile, the Biden administration is sending billions more to Ukraine and to Israel and everything. And they're taking their time. It's like, these are wonderful people.
They just had to throw in Ukraine, billions to Ukraine and Israel. Now listen, I am, it's pretty well known that I try and separate Ukraine and Israel because I don't think they are the same. I don't think the case is the same. I don't think the outcome, the fight between Ukraine and Russia is different than, the conflict in Israel with Gaza or Hezbollah or anybody else. I think those are different and they'd be treated different. I like Ukraine. To me, the biblical story in relation to Israel is critical. It is one of the things that makes it distinctive. And again, this guy, Andrew, he doesn't think that it's distinctive. And that's one of the reasons why he will lump them together. And I think he's wrong on that.
They are. And I will say for Trump, whatever people think of Trump, I know Trump well enough to have talked to him about this kind of stuff and, away from cameras. And his affection, love, gratitude toward those specific people is totally real.
Yeah.
And you can argue about whether, which policies serve those people best or whatever, but leadership begins with love. And if you don't love the people you lead, you'll mistreat them.
And you see it reciprocated, right?
But it's totally real.
Yeah.
And completely real, and it's emotional.
Yeah.
And he's like, I love those people.
Yeah.
And he means it. And he eats McDonald's in private.
Yeah, that's right.
So that is, I just want to say that because I know that for a fact. A lot of politics is obviously fake. But that specific part of Trump, like loving people like that, oh man.
Well, and it's the people that are, the most maligned in our country. The only people you can make fun of are like rural Southern Appalachian people, right? That's free game. You can criticize them all you want and mock them. Like, Jimmy Kimmel can make fun of them all day long on his show. No other group of people can you do that for. And they're the people that have been dispossessed of their country the most. And that's just a big reason why we moved to this place is these are the people that are hated. I want to go live with them.
Yeah.
This is one of those points in which I agree with these guys a lot. I've have a huge heart for, basically the castaways of America, which I think is one of the reasons why, why Trump won. And I think there was enough people who felt it in the way that a lot of people in Southern Appalachia feel. And I'm totally in agreement with these guys in terms of, I do love those people. I lived in North Carolina and my wife in North Carolina, Western North Carolina, in Appalachia. I feel like there's a lot that is they're mocked, ridiculed, and ignored. They're flyover country, that kind of thing. And I appreciate these guys speaking up for them.
I want to be around these because they're great people.
With the wonderful people. And cheerful too.
Yeah. Wonderful people.
Yeah. I live in a place with a lot of people like that. And, every third person has a child or grandson who's died of a drug OD. And like, there's no year-round work. And there's just a lot of problems. And these are like, you can pull into their driveway on a Sunday and they'll have a 6-pack and they'll give you 2 of them. I mean, they really are just the most generous, kind, hilarious, wise, just good people.
Yeah.
The best that this country's ever produced, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm not from those people at all. So I'm
no.
like coming at this like, wow, these people are incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think about that, right? And I think about the theology that has been that has shaped their outlook, and it's understandable because like you're especially in the midst of like serious decline. It's like, well, actually, it's sort of attractive to have this eschatology where everything is coming to an end, right? You can understand why people would eat that up. But the people that actually built America, right? The Puritans and all of the settlers of this country. You think of even like the founding generation. That theology did not exist yet. That wasn't until the middle of the 19th century that it came into being. Like they were actually optimistic, right? They viewed this continent as a place for Christians to build, to grow, to have a future.
What an interesting point. Well, I've never thought of that before. So dispensationalism, for those who haven't followed it, is normally criticized and defended because of its interpretation of what biblical Israel is now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a super electric topic, both
very
theologically and politically.
Absolutely.
And people get utterly hysterical about it and start calling you names or whatever.
Yeah.
So there's that. But you're saying that the deeper problem with it is that it makes people pessimistic.
Yeah.
Can you flesh it out a little bit?
Yeah. So,
all right. He's about to unpack that a little bit, but let me just say that one of the things he's about to kind of is that it's the decline of society around you that compels you to adopt an eschatology of decline. Meaning, if everything burns up, then what's the point in extending? What's the point in investing in the future? What's the point of thinking about the future if it's all going down anyways? And again, it's like there is a verse that coincides with this. Now, one of the things that, again, he doesn't say what his theology is, but having been associated, he's connected to Doug Wilson. Doug Wilson is one of the like strongest proponents of postmillennial eschatology, and postmillennial believes that it's almost like it's the optimistic theology of the end times. If premillennial is pessimistic, postmillennial is optimistic. And my read here is he's on the optimistic side, but not really, because he abandoned Minnesota for Tennessee. So if it's optimistic, why is it only optimistic in the place where he's moving? He ran away from the downward spiral, the collapse of Christendom in upper Midwest America. That's what he's running away from. And he's running to hide. No, that's cruel. He's running to build a community in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee, but yet remains optimistic. And Doug Wilson did the same thing in Moscow, Idaho, right? Like it's building these communities in kind of in the countryside, and having a theology that fits the optimism. And the reason why postmillennialism was kind of off the stage for a long time is because it died in World War I. It was a very popular eschatology until World War I, and then if World War I was a shot, then World War II was the kill shot. It just obliterated that theology. And what took off in its place was premillennialism, and specifically, and it's not all premillennialism is dispensationalism, but premillennial dispensationalism became the popular interpretation. Now, there is a verse that talks about basically the destruction of all things. And let me see if I can find it here. Shoot, I cannot find it. Why can't I find it? Oh, because I'm in the wrong chapter. All right. That's it. All right. All right. Now this is an eschatological verse. You can add in some of that. This is an eschatological verse from 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10 through I think 12. But the day of the Lord will become like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a roar. The heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed. And so all these things are thus to be dissolved. What sort of people ought you be in lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for the hastening and the coming of the day of the Lord, because of which the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, and the earthly bodies will melt as they burn. Okay? Again, like you can say that, oh, look at these weirdos believing that dispensational theology, there will be a rapture and that things will burn up. Well, I gave you one. Thessalonians talks about the rapture, and here in 2 Peter talking about everything's getting burned up. The heavens, everything will get burned up. Right? So I don't know when I was studying theology, I didn't know anybody that was post-millennial because it was so unusual. It's really honestly been the last 10 years that anybody's been trying to revive it. And it really comes out of Doug Wilson and Moscow, Idaho. That's kind of source one for that whole theology and its revival. It's very popular. So, but he's going to get into this a little bit further. So here we go.
So I think if you go your entire life believing that any minute the world is going to come to an end,
yes,
that I'm going to,
like maybe a thief in the night, any minute,
float up into heaven and my clothes will be here and
yes,
and everything we're gone. It's done. It's over. Right. Well, that takes a people that ordinarily are very low time preference, that build things for the future, that delay gratification.
Incrediwear is the first wearable anti-inflammatory. Not only does it take away the inflammation, but when you
and all of those kinds of things, and it flips it around and makes them very high time preference, where it's like, well, if the world's not going to be around tomorrow, why invest in anything for today? And you can even see this in terms of architecture, right? You think of the buildings that churches have, well, they're in strip malls, or they're, just they're kind of
garbage.
ugly. Yeah.
Garbage.
Yeah. And you look at the buildings that
it's like a former pet store in a strip mall.
Yeah. And you look at the buildings that Christians had before this was the dominant theology, and they're gorgeous. They're beautiful. And there were very poor people that made them, like you said earlier.
I know.
And it's like that right there, like you see it tangibly, that and you think about that in terms of all of life.
That is so smart. And what was the phrase you used? Low time preference?
Yeah, low time preference.
What does that
it's like
mean?
an economic phrase, right? So, right, your preference in terms of time.
Please respect my ignorance.
Yes. It just means that you're going to wait longer for things. It's sort of like the marshmallow test with little kids, right? Where the one where like in 5 minutes you'll get 2 marshmallows, or you can eat this one right now, right? Well, the child that says, "Oh, I'll wait, I want 2," right? Well, he's going to go on and have more success and so forth, versus the one that immediately grabs the one and eats it, right? Well, that's low time preference. It's a people that will delay gratification, who will save and invest and build things for the long term, for the future,
and for future generations.
Yes.
All right. So there's a bunch. He's not, again, the architecture thing. It is quite annoying that church buildings have gone from quite beautiful, spectacular, think Notre Dame in Paris, or some really, really gorgeous churches out there. You have that versus like the the metal building that is a rectangle that's cost $150,000 for the structure, and they're just putting stuff inside it, or the strip mall church. Again, like, I'd prefer the building that led people to think about God. And I think that kind of stuff matters. But I'm also thinking about 2 Peter right here, where he's talking about the thing that the low time preference people, there is potentially a sense of urgency. And that's actually what Peter's appealing to, is a sense of urgency. And there's other passages in the New Testament that speak to a sense of urgency. Like, this isn't going to last forever. Take the moment you have and use it. There's a big contrast between that kind of thinking and the one it's like, we're just going to kind of build things slowly, which is also a biblical truth. The Bible says, it comes like a thief in the night. You're not going to know when. You're not going to go how, but it's going to come. And I think you get both in the New Testament, which is can be challenging for some people.
Yeah.
They plant oak trees.
Yes.
Who plants oak trees?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're going to in Tennessee. We want to bring back the American chestnut in Tennessee. We want to bring that back.
Are you putting in evergreens, please?
Oh, I think everything. Yeah. I mean, there's pines. Yeah. There's
please don't neglect the pine.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I know it's a fast growing tree, relatively speaking, but it's
beautiful.
It's the answer. And cedars, if you can, if you have water.
Yeah, I don't know if we'll be able. I mean,
okay. Yeah, now we're going to get into. Since you're a preacher and Old Testament scholar, what was the inside of the temple clad with?
Cedar. Yeah, from Lebanon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So God Himself said cedar.
That's right. Yeah.
An accident? He was pretty specific about it.
Yeah. It smells great.
So maybe there's a reason my sauna has cedar on the inside.
That's right. Just think of it,
tell my kids that.
Just think of it like the temple.
It's my cedar church. Yes.
That's right.
No sacrifices, however. I'm sorry, I've gone so far afield. But so your point is that dispensationalism not only has specious theological elements, which I think very obviously it does.
Yeah.
It does not.
By the way, the whole theology was like laid out in the end notes. It's not actually in the Bible. It's like interpretation in the version of the Bible.
John Nelson Darby and Cyrus Schofield, and there's, they'll claim that they're antecedents from the early church. Like, well, this guy believed in something like the rapture, and it's like, well, it's always very, like you said, specious.
Yeah, that's my read as a non-theologian, but it does.
I think I've given you guys a couple of examples of where it's not so specious, but again, Thessalonians, 2 Peter
seem incredibly silly, but sincere. So okay.
Yeah, people. Yeah, exactly. People sincerely believe it. So
100%.
Mock them.
A lot of people I really like and respect believe.
Yes.
So I just want to say that. But you're saying that the cost is even deeper because it changes your worldview and makes it very difficult for you to engage in the labor of, like, for example, loving people around you and building something beautiful, which are also Christian imperatives. Is that what you're saying?
I think so. And it also, so it forces you into an immediacy, right? We got to do everything right now because there isn't going to be a future. Right? There's not going to be, and I heard this all the time growing up. Well, we're not going to be around. We're going to be raptured. So why plan for the future? Why build things for the future? Why
heard that growing up?
Oh yeah. This was just everywhere in evangelicalism.
Did you grow up in that?
Yeah. I did. And
all right. One truthism I've almost never had proven wrong is the people that grow up to be the most anti-something, I say anti-dispensationalist, grew up dispensationalist. I find that the people who grew up in kind of a, let's say a Pentecostal or charismatic denomination, they come to reject the work of the Holy Spirit and cessationist and super reformed. And then I find the other way. I find people who grew up Catholic become charismatic, or they grew up Presbyterian. Like people tend to it. And I think it's something, should always kind of check your heart. Is this, am I reacting to this idea or this theology because of like my upbringing, or is it like I really think this? Sometimes it's both. Don't get me wrong, but check yourself, because it's like I would say that this guy's reacting. He's so strident in it. I mean, it's like this is the only video that he's going at this stuff like this, I'm planning to watch. I've watched a few others. I got more, but yeah, there's a lot here.
I remember in college when I was first getting into more historical theology, or thinking like, what did people believe before the 19th century about things? and it's
for the first 1800 years.
Yeah. What did they? Well, there are various different eschatological schools. Like there's all sorts of different views of how the end works. But when I first get into that, I'm thinking like, I don't know if I actually believe in the rapture. And I remember being in college and in campus ministry and telling people this. I'm like, I don't know if I actually believe in that. I mean, it was like I just uttered the greatest heresy of all time. Like I could have said, I probably could have said, well, just denied the Trinity or something, right? And they would have been like, oh, well, that's interesting. But saying, I don't think there's a rapture. What? Are you serious? Right? Like that is central doctrine to many Christians, and it has this deep, emotional connection. Because I mean, if you've grown up your entire life hearing this, and it's just assumed by everybody, right? It's hard to break out of that, even though the everybody of the historic church of millions or billions of Christians, right? It's actually a tiny minority in the history of the church that has believed that, but presently, it's a majority of evangelicals.
Yeah, it seems like that theology is dying. That's just my sense, but I
all right. It's not a majority of evangelicals. It's not a majority of Christians, actually. Most Christians are, I would say, and by Christians, I'm adding Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox and all people who call themselves Christians together. And in that way, majority of Christians are what's called amillennial. It's neither post nor pre. It's like the millennial is allegorical and happening now, and eventually there'll be just one return of Christ, and that's it. And so it's that's I mean, it's not surprising that for most of the last that the premillennial thing came on the stage in late 1800s, which is true. And up until then, there was other views, but honestly, there's a lot less teaching of eschatology within the Catholic Church. Up until the Reformation, everybody was Catholic, or Orthodox, and it's the same. Both of them are amillennial in their eschatology. Both of them see the church as the kingdom of God. And therefore, the connection to the end times is very different than what is found in some of these Protestant circles, particularly the premillennial post. But yeah, it's a very it's not surprising. It shouldn't be surprising, but it doesn't make it insignificant or untrue. The fact that people didn't talk about it for a couple thousand years, it's reasonable based upon Scripture.
I'd be the last to really know.
No, I think your instincts are correct. I think some of it is, some of it too, especially in the latter half of the 20th century, right after Israel is formalized as a state in 1948. Well, that gives like big confirmation that, okay, things are happening. Like there's an Israel in Revelation and a temple in Revelation. So it's happening, guys. So we've got 40 years, right? 1988, that's the end. Well, then that doesn't happen. And then people make all sorts of other guesses.
Oh, I wasn't even aware of that. So the idea was 1988 's the end of the world?
40 years after 1948, right? That's when the rapture is coming. That was I think there was a book like 88 Reasons Why Jesus is Coming Back in 1988, right? And I'm sure it sold a lot of copies, and then of course didn't Didn't happen.
Wow.
But
Well, Mike Dukakis lost. No, I mean, that's not obviously the rapture, but whatever, we'll take it.
For people in Massachusetts, maybe it was, but yeah, it's just so interesting because like I look at it, like you look at Matthew 24, right? That's the big text that people point to. And
what does it say?
Where Jesus says, well, there's going to be wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes in various places and plagues and things like that. But right before it, right, well, Jesus is in the temple and he's fighting with the chief priests and he's telling them, he's fighting with them at Passover. So thousands of people surrounding them. He's embarrassing them in the temple. And
his boldness is really shocking.
Yes.
To people who haven't read it before.
Yes.
The rage that he displays at the leadership.
Yes.
The religious leadership is just like it's
nothing else.
It comes right off the page.
And which is so ironic because you see evangelicals who are like, you need to be more Christ-like, right? You need to be, which means like wimpy and weak and inoffensive.
Sweeping into the temple and knocking over tables and driving people out with a whip.
And then going into the temple and giving this parable, right, where of the vineyard, right? He's like, first I sent this servant, you beat him and stoned him, and then you killed another one. Well, I'll send my son. And they'll respect him. And then it's the heir, right? If we kill him, we could take the vineyard for ourselves, right? And yes, what's he going to do to these people? Well, he's going to come and he's going to destroy all of them. And it's like, and they knew, right? The hilarious thing, I think, like reading the Gospels is, right, Jesus is giving parables, and the point of the parables is actually to conceal what he's saying. And people are like, whoa, what's that? Even his own disciples are like, what's that about? I don't really know. Like, it doesn't make any sense. But he's telling parables to the chief priests and the Pharisees and all the leaders of Israel. And they're like, oh, that's about us.
I think it says they understood it was about them.
They knew.
And they decided to kill him.
Yeah. So the parables are like obscure to everybody else, but when it's about them, like, oh, he's talking about us, right? But talk about speaking truth to power. I mean, I don't know how.
All right. So I feel like because Andrew brings up this passage in another place, I thought I would unpack this a little for you guys. And let me just read the parable of the tenants, and then we can talk about perhaps what it means. And he says, here another parable. There was a master of a house who planted a vineyard and put a fence around it and dug a winepress in it and built a tower and leased it to tenants and went into another country. When the season for the fruit drew near, he sent his servants to the tenants to get his fruit. And the tenants took his servants, beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again, he sent other servants, more than the first, and did the same thing to them. Finally, he sent his son to them, saying, they will respect my son. But then the tenants saw the son, and they said to themselves, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him and have his inheritance. And they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. When therefore the owner of the vineyard comes, what he will do to those tenants? And they said to him, well, he will put those wretches to the miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants and give them the fruit in their season. And Jesus said to them, have you not read the scriptures? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and a miraculous in our eyes. Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to the people producing its fruit. And the one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parable and perceived that he was speaking about them. And although they were seeking to arrest him, they feared the crowds because they held him to be a prophet. All right. So the interpretation of that passage by guys like Andrew here is that obviously is often read to be that is talking about Jesus is talking about himself. Jesus is talking about like he is the son, in that parable who's going to be killed outside. and it will be taken from you and given to another who bear fruit. And the interpretation that is given of that is that fruit given to another it's given to the Gentiles. It's given to the church, or it's given to somebody else who bear, like, and therefore Israel and the Jews as a people are cut off. Again, this is classic supersessionist or replacement theology. But you have to read into, you have to have read the whole of the book of Matthew to have that interpretation. You have to have read into it. You could be like, he is talking to the chief priests and the Pharisees in that passage. So what does it mean to them? And who's the audience? In the book of Matthew, the audience is all Jews. In actually Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's very few references at all to Gentiles. When they're there, it's not always great either. The exchanges are uncomfortably awkward. I mean, Jesus has some good words to say, but it's a rare encounter. The primary audience of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are Jews. And so how do you think the Jews would have interpreted that? That's how you should think about this. But we don't have that from Andrew, because Andrew puts himself in that story. He thinks it's about him, and it's not. It's about it. It could very well be that the fruit that is being given, because the parable before it and the parable after are both talking about the people who Jesus spent most of his time with, which was the sinners and the tax collectors. What if the message to the chief priests and the Pharisees isn't that I'm going to take this away from, he's going to take this away from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and he's going to give it to these Galileans who are going to take that message and go to all the Jews in the whole wide world? What if that's the message? I think it could be, actually. Because this is before the death and resurrection of Jesus. And Jesus is talking about his death. One would think you'd probably talk about his resurrection too, because it's like it's not the death that makes Jesus, the key feature. It's his resurrection. That's the important part. All right. So, yeah. Thanks for hanging in here, guys. There's a little bit more to go. Trust me.
That Jesus was kept for me as a, lifelong churchgoer. I have no idea.
Yeah.
But you just read it. I would recommend everyone read it, non-Christians alike.
But he's there. He's right there. And especially the Gospel of Matthew. I love it because it is.
But Mark too.
Yeah, all four. I mean, obviously all four of them, but like Matthew in particular is so cool to me because like you read it and the way it's organized is Jesus is recapitulating the entire history of Israel, right? So right in the very beginning, he goes out into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, right? Just like Israel's in the wilderness for 40 years, right? And is tempted by Satan. He comes, right, after he crosses is baptized in the Jordan, is like crossing the Red Sea, goes into the wilderness. Then after that, right, he's preaching a sermon on a mountain, expounding the law, which is Moses on Sinai, right? And after this, he's telling parables of the kingdom, like he's David or like he's Solomon, writing Proverbs, writing Psalms. And then he begins all of these excoriations of the high priesthood and the Pharisees and all the leaders of Israel. Well, what's that like? It's like the prophets, right? So he's reliving the whole history of Israel in his lifetime. What's Matthew doing there? What's the Holy Spirit doing there? It's showing that Jesus is Israel, right? He's the true Israel, right? He is as the Apostle Paul says, he's the chosen seed of Abraham, right? He's the one that carries out Israel's mission, which is, dovetail. I'm kind of doing the weave too, like I'm doing the weave.
It's Trumpian.
It is. People. I mean, when I'm preaching, people are like, "Andrew, you're doing the weave like President Trump." And I try not Trump.
It's interesting.
I try not to do the hand motions and things like him too. But we all have our own rhetorical style. It's interesting because, right, like the whole dispensational thing, where it's like, okay, right, the old covenant still somehow sort of exists, and there's still this, this distinction between Jew and Gentile out there. Well, like the whole New Testament talks about this, that no, right, that separation that existed in the old covenant, right, they're brought together as one, in Jesus, who is the true Israel, the successful Israel, the Israel that's obedient and goes to the death and is vindicated by being resurrected, right? And that old covenant, it's done. It's over, right? Those distinctions between Jew and
All right. This is a very important part. And for those who have stuck with me as far, I truly appreciate it. But like that, him saying that the distinction between Jews and Gentiles is no longer there, and that the old covenant, as he calls it, is no longer relevant. I don't even think that Paul had that thought. And again, I bring you to the fact that if Paul thought that the old covenant was done, then why would he do the practices and be admonished to continue the practices that were from the old covenant, keeping of law, kosher, circumcision, etc.? He affirms all those. He does. He affirms them by doing them. And one of the important things is you interpret scripture from scripture. So if you're reading Galatians and Romans or any of the other epistles of Paul as if he's doing away with like the Hebrew Bible, you're wrong. You're doing it wrong. You're reading it wrong, because he's not. Which means then, how do we read it? Now there's a verse in Galatians chapter, I think it's chapter 2, where Paul is talking about the difference between the covenant with Abraham and the Mosaic covenant, the law. And he says in there that the law came 430 years after the promise. But the covenant that came after does not nullify the covenant that came before it. So Paul is saying that the Mosaic covenant did not nullify the Abrahamic covenant. And if the Abrahamic covenant, if he's saying that that's a principle, that the one that comes after does not nullify the one that comes before it, that means that the Adamic covenant still stands, the Noahic covenant still stands, the Abrahamic covenant still stands, the Mosaic covenant still stands, the Davidic covenant still stands, and the new covenant gets added into that progression of truth, of revelation, of covenant with God. It is not nowhere in the New Testament is it done away with. Okay, like Jesus does not say, he literally says I did not come to abolish the law, but fulfill it. And we interpret fulfill to mean like we're done, like it's over, like none of that matters anymore. It's all done. It's all complete. It's like that obviously, and this is a New Testament principle. The New Testament principle is even if you practice those things, like the practice of something does not, in and of itself, is not salvific. It is the whom that you are having faith in that is salvific. Meaning, like we use the reason we lean into Abraham is because Abraham believed God; it was credited to him as righteousness. That is the understanding of how we as Gentiles and well, all followers of true sons of Abraham, we believe God. Our righteousness comes from our belief. And then if we are doing the works of righteousness, meaning we're doing the keeping kosher and those types of things, right? Like I'm Gentile, so I don't have to. But if you're Jewish and you're doing those, like that, if you're doing them just to do them, it's basically meaningless. But if you're doing them because you believe in the God who told you to do them, then it is impactful. It's the belief that makes it salvific. Okay. Now I get that what I'm saying is might seem novel, but it's not. Lots of church in pastors in history have thought this way. Okay. Jonathan Edwards, who came long before dispensational theology, saw the restoration of physical Israel as part of God's rest, like the unfolding of God's time will be accompanied by the restoration, the physical restoration of Israel. And Jonathan Edwards is a pretty significant Reformed figure. Same with Spurgeon also. There's a bunch of theologians I could go on, But that type of stuff is it is the distinction between Jew and Gentile is real, but the universal does not obliterate the particular, and that's the truth. Because there's another verse in Galatians. Now there's no longer Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free. All are one in Christ, which is true. Okay, at the foot of the cross, we're all the same. But to think that Paul makes no distinction between men and women is absurd. He makes a big distinction all through the epistles. So therefore, if there is a particular to men and women, even in the midst of understanding the universal, then there's probably a distinction between Jew and Greek, which is Jew and Gentile. And I think that's a huge distinction. And it, again, positionally, before Christ, we're the same. Particularly, we're different. I mean, the rules for the Gentiles were different. We were not obligated to Torah. We're not obligated to keep kosher, keep Shabbat, do the things. It's not on us. What we're obligated to repeatedly in the New Testament is don't worship idols, don't eat strangled animals, don't drink blood, and don't fornicate. Those are the rules that are given to us. Now, we barely could handle that. So, all right.
And Gentile, they're gone.
It says that only about 1,000 times in every book of the New Testament. So to come to the opposite conclusion does make you sort of wonder, like, have you read it?
Yeah. And
I have the same thing for them. It's like they are taught, I swear they're taught to read it this way. And if they're left to their own device, left to once you crack that door, a lot will go through it. Trust me. Start thinking about Acts 21. Get around. That's what you got to deal with. If you're making all this stuff about how the church wholesale replaces the Jews and the promises to Israel, you're not reading the New Testament right.
Exactly. And
whether you believe it or not, that's just not what it says at all.
Yeah. And so you think about that, and it's like, okay, these two are brought together. I mean, the whole book of Acts is about this, right? That the Holy Spirit not only goes to the apostles and the Jews in Jerusalem, but the Gentiles get it too. Like Peter goes to Cornelius and he believes, and now here is this Roman, right? This Gentile. And the interesting thing about that too is there's this misconception that the only people in the Old Testament that believed in God were Jews. But it's like everywhere they go, there are these Gentile God-fearers that believe in God. And Cornelius is one of them in the New Testament.
Well, let me just talk about that real quick. It was such a shock to Peter that Cornelius' servants came to him, and then ultimately Cornelius came to Peter. But it was such a shock to Peter that this Gentile wanted to follow Jesus, that what did Peter do? The very next thing he did, he went back to Jerusalem and told the elders of Jerusalem what happened. He didn't know what to do. And then a couple chapters later, you have the Council of Jerusalem trying to figure out, what do we do with these Gentile Christians or these Gentile followers of Jesus? It was not like it was a surprise, which is, I mean, it's good. As a Gentile Christian, I'm happy that the surprise happened. But again, Andrew is reading himself way into the story long before he should. It is a miracle. It is by God's grace that we as Gentiles get to partake in this story. But it's by and large a Jewish story, and we get to partake in it. But Paul warns us in that we should not become arrogant. That it's not we who sustain the root, it's the root sustains us. Paul says that. He probably overlooked that part. Both Tucker and Andrew here skipped over that part for sure.
It's all through the New Testament. And in fact, Jesus calls out repeatedly Gentiles as the most faithful. Repeatedly.
Yes.
The Roman officer.
Yes. Again, he says this in the Gospels. Like he's talking about, right, the faithless and adulterous generation, right? He's talking about Israel, and right, he's saying in the resurrection, right, Sodom and Gomorrah and Tyre and Sidon, they'll rise, right? Sodom, destroyed for trying to rape angels. They will rise up in judgment on this generation, because if the things that I'm doing, right, if the Son of God appeared to them and preached to them, they would have repented, right? And Nineveh, right, this Gentile city in the Old Testament of Assyrians, right, brutal, bloodthirsty people, right? Noah shows up, or Jonah shows up, and he preaches, and his only message is 40 days, Nineveh is going to be destroyed, right? He's gleeful about this. And the king hears about it. He repents. He makes all the people in the city wear sackcloth and ashes. And it's like, well, I don't really know what's going to happen, but this looks serious. We better repent. And we're going to go in the deep weeds here if you let me. I'm not filibustering like President Putin did, right. You look at the book of Jonah in particular. He flees not because he's afraid of the Assyrians, right? That's what people think is like he's scared to go there. No, like you read the end of the book of Jonah, and he's arguing with God at the end, and he's saying, I knew that you would show mercy on these people, right? I knew you would show them mercy. That's why I didn't want to go, right? He was trying to outwit God, like trick God into not being gracious to these Gentiles, because he knows in the law, right, in Deuteronomy, right, one of the signs that Israel is about to be cursed is that he is going to call nations, right, the Gentiles, right, nations that do not know him, to himself. He's going to go to the Gentiles and away from Israel. Yeah. And that means judgment is going to come upon Israel. So Jonah knows this. And he's like, I am going the opposite direction. I'm going to Tarshish, to Spain. Yeah. Because I am not going to let God judge my people, right? That's why he's angry about this. And it gets even more interesting because Jesus talks about the sign of Jonah to Israel. And people think, oh, well, he's talking about the resurrection, being in the ground for 3 days and 3 nights. And it's like, that's symbolic, that's typological. He's drawing on that typology. But it's not about that. It's that what's going to happen, Gentiles are going to hear the gospel and not you. Yeah. Right. And that judgment is going to come on Israel, right? Judgment is going to come on this generation. And that's what Jesus says at the beginning of Matthew 24 is these things are going to happen in this generation, right? He's walking with the disciples in the temple, and they're marveling at we would marvel too. I mean, beautiful, like the whole thing is clad in gold on the outside, is gorgeous, beautiful. Giant, massive stones that it boggles your mind how Megaliths. Human beings could move these things and build this stuff without, modern power tools, right? They're marveling at the temple, and Jesus says, what are you looking at? Do you not know that not one stone is going to be left upon another very soon? And they're like, oh boy, when's this going to happen?
Well, 37 years later, actually.
Yeah. Well, I think we can debate, I think
whenever, but the
40 years later, but
40 years later, but I mean,
I'll be autistic on that point with you.
The second revolt. Yeah. It's normally said to be 70.
I think the resurrection is in 30. I mean, we're coming up on 2,000 years of that.
The point is,
all right, let me just unpack that a little bit. Cause he's not like, I have a lot to say on Jonah. For the interest of time, I will keep it short. And what I think he's implying there is, and I'm not implying, I think he's pretty much stating it, is that the picking up of the story of the sign of Jonah is a sign that there will be a curse upon the nation of Israel. And one of the things that is a part of that curse is that and this comes, Jesus actually says this even in the Gospel of Luke, that the Gentiles will trample on Jerusalem, right? That there will be this unfolding, and lots will be destroyed, and in a sense, destruction is coming. Okay, now where I think he basically stops the story of Israel and the Jews right there. Okay. And I think he's wrong because there is an end to that part of the story, according to Jesus himself, right? He says in the Gospel of Luke, he says, I gotta put my glasses on. He says, talking about destruction of Jerusalem, and there's a lot there I could unpack. Chapter 21, and it says they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. There is an end to that. And then Paul in Romans picks up that when the fullness of Gentiles has come in, all Israel will be saved. So there's a point in which the restoration of Israel is coming. And people like Jonathan Edwards understood that. Where Andrew here is, he stops. He basically ends the story of Israel at that point and rejects and like basically takes the establishment of modern Israel. Like he suddenly goes from being able to spiritualize everything to being able to spiritualize nothing, meaning he can't even see the fact that modern Israel, the establishment of modern Israel, is part of the restoration of the promises of God to that people, the Jews. Like he basically takes that and says, oh, it's a thing of time and chance, and it's just God's not in it. Can't be God, right? Because that would suddenly make me a dispensationalist, and because I grew up that way and I can't do that anymore, I'm gonna be like this hardcore supersessionist guy. And it's like the church replace it all, and also like we're going off into amazingness, and all earth will know God because I'm post millennial. All that stuff is a big leap for me. And again, I have nothing against the people who affirm that. I know a ton of them. I used to be one. Okay, I just think a better reading of the New Testament sees the restoration of God and the relationship with the Jews as a continuing process. God's not done with them yet. And I think, I think there's a lot more I could say about that. All right. So I'm going to actually, we're an hour and a half into this, and I'm going to leave it there. There is a little bit more, not much, nothing of substance. It goes on to talk more about his community in Tennessee and the stuff he's doing. The whole talk is an hour and a half, and I try my best to not, you don't need to hear me interrupt these guys, make a 2.5 hour show. But I really appreciate anybody who's at this point still watching me. Thank you so much. You're my friend. And please like and subscribe. You probably are. If you're watching this long, you're probably like a like and subscriber for sure. So thank you very much for sticking around. Appreciate it. Consider giving a gift to the Fields Project. Link in the bio on how to do that. And I appreciate it so much. And until next time, see you later.